I think the biggest lie that we tell ourselves, and you probably also tell yourself, is that throughout development you're gonna say something similar to, oh yeah, my game is done, all I need is just more content. And it sounds like a good point, because hey, if your game is done, that means like most of the mechanics of your game are implemented, like the things that usually feel like are the hardest, like programming the mechanics, because that is creating brand new things. All we have to do now is like our content crunch, making more enemies, more weapons, more levels, more biomes, more everything else basically. But I think what a lot of developers, and we definitely, that's why I wanted to make this video, don't understand is that actually this is probably one of the hardest parts of game development. It's not coming up with these mind-breakingly cool mechanics and things like that are gonna take you like 2 weeks to a month maybe if you really are struggling and doing something really weird to getting implemented. It's going to be all of the content surrounding that single mechanic or other mechanics as well that's going to make your game feel like a game. So I wanted to talk a bit more about that because recently we've been memeing about it a bit too much in our studio, I think, or for Overtime Anomaly, for example, which is like a horror game that we're making. We're like, oh yeah, the game is done, technically. It's like, oh yeah, we could ship the game and there just wouldn't be like enough tasks and enough anomalies, but the mechanics of reporting and all of that, that's perfectly implemented. Now we just have to do more. But now we're realizing that, hey, actually, now the hard part only begins. And I think something similar to illustrate this, we often say, or at least in other industries, it's like, oh yeah, you have the 80-20 rule. Like you can get 80% done in the first 20%, and then that last 20% takes 80% of the time. With game dev, it's more something like, okay, you get 80% done in 20% of the time, and then you have another 80% to get done before the game is actually done, because things like your scope increase, and you realize so many more things are wrong with your game. So I want to talk a bit more about, hey, how do we make good content? How do we make the most out of it? And what are some things that I've had to learn? Because we've said this about every single game. Forge Industry, for example, one of the biggest downfalls that I think that game had was kind of the fact that the content wasn't good. We'll talk about that a bit more in a second. But with content, like I said, I'm talking about everything that gives your game more length. That's kind of what separates your game at the end of the day between a like 10-minute itch.io prototype demo, whatever thing, versus a 2 to 4 hour cohesive experience that you can ask money for. Even things like dialogue, for example, if you're making visual novels, it's like, yeah, getting the visual novel engine and the core idea and you got your few character pieces of art, that's fine. But now suddenly you have to write 20 hours of like lore and whatever. And it's like, actually, this is harder than I thought. Because I think what makes it more tricky is that you don't think of content as something that's going to take a lot of time. When you start planning your game, you're like, okay, I'm gonna spend this much time on my proof of concept to find out if the gameplay is fun. And I'm gonna spend this much time on modeling like the main characters and like the big things. But you don't think about all of those other small things, like your props, like your interactables, like your dialogue lines, your voice lines, your items, all of that. It's not inherently hard most of the time to do those things. Like making an item, I'm assuming a game with items, of course, making an item probably you can do in like a few minutes. If you want to be fancy, you have like some custom tooling and some custom editors so you can very quickly make them. You just drag in your model and you're like, this is an item now. The problem is in the amount of content that you have to create often. Not only that, and that's kind of the big trap that I also want to warn you about, it's not just quantity, it's definitely, I think, especially with content, more of a quality thing as well. Where a lot of game developers, they're like, yeah, my first indie game, I don't want to make small games. I want to make a game that's 6 to 8 hours in length, which is, I think, what I hear the most of people when they have like their dream game length. And I think it's a noble attempt. It's a good attempt. It's a good time to put into your game. The problem you run into then is that, let's say it's a linear level. This is also why open world games often are more praised. Or for example, roguelikes and Metroidvanias, because you don't have to reuse as much of your level. You can spend weeks or even months sometimes on making a single stage for your game. Let's assume you're making a 3D platformer or whatever. And a player can go through that in like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and they will probably never look at that again. And you spend months of time developing it. So that is one thing where, for example, roguelikes are just better, because if you only have one stage and you just keep rerunning through the entire stage, well, you're getting more return on investment, so to say, for how much playtime you're getting from your level, basically. Something like Unicycle Pizza Time, there's only one level, so basically all of the effort I put into it, it's worth it, because people are going to only be playing that one level. It's not like, oh, it's going to be a very small part of the gameplay, and then they're going to move on and they're not going to care anymore at all. And the second problem is not just the time it takes you to make the levels and the content and whatever. But it's the trap of, okay, you can optimize this and you can automate this. The problem you run into then is that your content kind of just sucks. It's not interesting. It doesn't add to the gameplay. This is what I meant with Forge Industry, for example. We had that core game idea of we had our buildings and they could process items, and then we got outputted items. It's a factory automation game. You get how it works. But you know, you can't have just two items like your lumberyard and your refinement station. You need to have more. So we added more buildings and we added more items. We had like Fletcher stations if you wanted to make bows and arrows. And that was fine. And I think we ended up with like 600, 700 items in our game, but like all of the ores and all of the like individual parts. The problem we ran into then is that the buildings weren't doing anything new. It was just the same mechanic, reused, repackaged in different visuals, but no mechanical difference. And this is something that you can do maybe once or twice, but you can't do it for basically the entire game. We had more buildings that did the same thing than that did other things. Like we had a few special buildings, but not that many, honestly. And the problem is then that there's not much incentive to really keep playing because you're just doing more of the same. You're not advancing as a player. You always need to give them more cool stuff. And the problem that we also had is, okay, we automated. We're like, just like, okay, we have 13 ores and we have 50 items, and now we mesh all of them together and like make the variants automatically. The problem then is that, like I said, it's also boring because they don't do much specifically. Like there's all numbers assigned to it behind it, but nothing really that people can care about. It's not like they have special effects and whatever. I think if you want to draw this to the extreme, you have games like Borderlands, and I think it was Borderlands 3 where they were like, okay, this game has over 1 billion guns. That was kind of their marketing thing. And it's like, cool, but those are not 1 billion handcrafted guns. And because the changes are so minimal, it's like, you just pick up the gun and you genuinely don't really care that much about the specific individual gun that you pick up. You just take whatever you get, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because everything is kind of similar anyway. And that's another big trap, because now you've spent a lot of time making all of that content and you feel good, but your players are not going to enjoy it. And then I hear you already type out your comments like, okay, yeah, but of course we're not going to automate it. We're going to handcraft all of these things. And then the problem you run into is that actually you're going to have to do way more mechanics. And suddenly the game you thought was done, and it was technically done in the original scope you set out for, you realize that the game in the current state is not good enough and not content rich enough yet to release. But if you want to get it to a point where you have enough meaningful content, it means expanding on your mechanics. It means adding more cool abilities to whatever game you're making. This is something we're doing right now with Magical Girl Guardians, where, yeah, we have the core loop of your survivor-like, but we don't have enough upgrades. And it's like, yeah, we can make the 5% movement speed increases and whatever, but those things aren't really the exciting stuff. Nobody's playing a survivor-like only for every upgrade basically they can get to be like a little stat change, like, oh, 5% more movement speed or 3% more armor. It's like, that's boring. It's not visual. It's not cool. You don't want that. So we, instead have to look at, okay, special abilities, increasing like the amount of bullets you're shooting and all of that. And those are things that on its own aren't that hard to implement. But it's the amount, once again, because you need to have quality content, but there still needs to be so much because you underestimate how much players actually want from games as well. You can't just put in 10 items and call it a day. People want to feel like, hey, there's a lot of value in this game. Look at 4X games, and now every 4X game has like hundreds of hours of content in that. It takes so long, and it's not just like 2 days of like writing your content or like your descriptions or your items and putting them in your engine. It actually takes a lot more time. And that's the final thing, like if we go back to the 4X games, the problem then is also like more content, it cascades. Like if you have that small proof of concept with like your mechanics, your minimum viable product, and you have like 10 pieces of content in it, like your items, your characters, your weapons, whatever, debugging that and also making sure that, hey, everything is kind of balanced. No specific build or item combination is like super overpowered. It's kind of easy because you can manually in your brain think about, okay, how is the item balancing and all of that. The problem is if you suddenly scale it to 600, those were once again issues that we ran into with Forge Industry. It's like balancing all of these things, it's exponential. It's not linear in like the hard, like more items takes more time linearly. No, suddenly going from 10 to 100 items, it's going to suck to balance and all of that, because suddenly one change is not going to influence 9 items, but it's going to influence 99 other items. So I think that is another thing to keep in mind. Now, what is the solution to this? And unfortunately, I can't be like, oh, just don't have content in your game, because then you don't really have a game. I think a more important thing is just be aware that content is one of the hardest parts of game development. Even though it's not hard in terms of writing code and making them assets and whatever, it's just hard in making sure that it's good and it's implemented. So don't think like, oh, I'm gonna spend 3 months on a game and I'm gonna spend the first 2.5 months working on my mechanics and whatever, and I'm gonna add content for a week and I'm gonna do 1 week of marketing, because you're in for a very bad time then. Because if you do end up sticking with that 1 week for content, you'll release with a game that had so much potential, but didn't have the items and the content and the length of play for people to actually want to follow up with it and keep going at it. I think in our case, rushing content and not really stopping and being like, hey, actually the stuff we're doing for Forge Industry, it's not that good, the content isn't meaningful, is a big mistake with it. Something that we recently re-encountered in another video where I talked about our recently cancelled project Skogfall, which was City Builder. We kind of ran into the same problem where, sure, our mechanics were there, but it wasn't interesting, and the amount of work required to add all of the content and make all of it interesting suddenly ballooned our scope to something that we honestly didn't want. I'm curious, how have you been experiencing the content slog? Is it something that you've been running into with issues as well? Or are you like, hey, actually, what are you talking about? I think I can churn out content that is really good for my games very quickly. If so, what's the secret? I want to know, because we aren't at the point yet, I think. Anyways, that's all I had to say. I hope this was interesting and maybe made you reconsider a little bit about like, hey, what are the priorities in my games development? If you're new here, we upload 2 videos every week talking about game development and the things that we've been learning, making our own games and experimenting with it basically. If that's something that you're interested in, be sure to head down below and subscribe. You're gonna like the content and I get happy if I see the number go up. So thank you very much for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!